The camera was running. The audience was waiting. And Johnny Carson, the man who had controlled every second of American late-night television for nearly 2 decades, had nothing to say. It was 1980, maybe 1981. The exact date doesn't matter as much as what happened that night. Carl Sagan sat in the guest chair speaking about a photograph taken from the edge of the solar system, a photograph of Earth, a pale blue dot suspended in a sunbeam, barely visible against the vastness of space. Carson did what he always did. He listened. He nodded. He prepared the next question in his mind, the way a craftsman prepares his tools. But somewhere in the middle of Sagan's explanation, something shifted. The joke didn't come. The pivot to commercial didn't come. The room, for reasons no one could quite name, fell into a kind of stillness that felt less like television and more like church. This was not the plan. Johnny Carson did not do stillness. He did precision. He did timing. He did control. For 23 years, he had walked onto that stage and turned chaos into clockwork. Guests who rambled were gently redirected. Silence was filled. Dead air was death. And yet that night, he let the silence sit. The audience didn't know what to do with it. Neither did Johnny. 2 hours before the taping, Carson sat in his dressing room with a stack of blue index cards. On each card, a question. On each question, a possible answer, anticipated and prepared for. This was his method. This was how he survived live television while others crumbled under the pressure. Carl Sagan was not an unknown quantity. He had been on the show before. He was articulate, enthusiastic, reliable. He spoke about the cosmos in a way that made people feel small and significant at the same time. He was good television. But something was different that night. The research notes mentioned a new book, a new series, something about billions and billions of stars, though Sagan himself would later insist he never said the phrase that way. The phrase belonged to Carson's impression of him, an affectionate parody that had become more famous than the man himself. Johnny flipped through the cards. He underlined a question about Mars. He crossed out a joke that felt too cheap. He checked his watch. 30 minutes to air. Ed McMahon knocked twice and entered without waiting for an answer. That was their rhythm. 30 years of it. "You ready?" Ed asked. "Always," Johnny said. It wasn't true, but it was the only answer he knew how to give. The Tonight Show occupied a strange space in American life. It was not news, but people trusted it more than news. It was not art, but it shaped culture more than most art ever would. And at the center of it every night was a man from Nebraska who had learned to hide behind a smile so convincing that even he sometimes forgot it was a mask. Carson's genius was not in being funny. There were funnier comedians. His genius was in being safe. He was the last voice Americans heard before sleep. He was the reassurance that the world, no matter how strange it had become during the day, would still make sense at 11:30 p.m. But safety requires boundaries, and boundaries require control. Sagan, in his way, was about to violate both. The interview began normally. Sagan spoke about the Voyager missions, the twin spacecraft that had been launched in 1977 to explore the outer planets. He spoke with his characteristic enthusiasm, his voice rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost musical. Carson asked about Jupiter. Sagan answered. He asked about Saturn's rings. Sagan answered. The audience laughed at a reference to little green men. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. Then Sagan mentioned the photograph. Before Voyager left the solar system, Sagan said, we turned it around. We pointed its camera back toward Earth, and we took a picture. Carson nodded. This was in the notes. He had a follow-up prepared. But Sagan didn't stop. In that photograph, Sagan continued, Earth is less than a pixel, a pale blue dot suspended in a sunbeam. That's us. That's home. That's everyone you've ever known, everyone you've ever loved, every human being who ever lived out their lives on that dot. The studio was quiet. Not the nervous quiet of a joke that didn't land, but something else, something heavier. Carson opened his mouth to speak. Then he closed it. Sagan kept going. Every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, on that mote of dust. The audience wasn't laughing. They weren't supposed to laugh. But they also weren't doing the other thing audiences do, which is wait for permission to feel. They were just feeling. And Johnny Carson, the man who gave permission, was silent. There is a moment in every performer's life when the performance stops working. Not because the skill has faded, but because the distance between the role and the self has collapsed. The mask becomes too heavy. The script becomes too thin. For Carson, that moment had been building for years. He had hosted over 4,000 episodes. He had interviewed presidents and poets, astronauts and athletes, movie stars and murderers. He had been married 3 times. He had buried a son. He had built an empire and discovered that empires, even small ones, are lonelier than anyone wants to admit. The joke was his refuge. The laugh was his proof of life. But what do you do when the joke doesn't fit? What do you do when the thing being said is too true, too large, too final to deflect? You stay quiet, and you let it land. Sagan was still speaking. His voice had softened, but it hadn't lost its intensity. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. Carson's face did something it rarely did on camera. It stopped performing. The smile didn't vanish, but it changed. It became smaller, more real, more fragile. The eyes, usually so bright and alert, softened. He looked for just a moment like a man instead of a host. The director in the booth noticed. He zoomed in slightly, an instinct born from years of knowing when something mattered. How frequent their misunderstandings, Sagan said. How eager they are to kill one another. How fervent their hatreds. The camera stayed on Carson. This was unusual. Normally, the camera would cut back to the guest, especially during a monologue this long. But something told the director to stay, to let America see what he was seeing. Johnny wasn't nodding anymore. He was just listening. Really listening. The way you listen when someone is saying something you've always known but never heard spoken aloud. Ed McMahon sat off to the side, out of frame. He had been with Johnny since the beginning. He knew every tell, every shift in energy, every micro-expression that signaled what was coming next. And what he saw on Johnny's face scared him a little. Not because Johnny was breaking down. Johnny never broke down. But because Johnny had stopped managing. He had stopped directing traffic. He had stopped being the host and become, just for a moment, a member of the audience. Ed had seen Johnny cry once, off camera, in 1962, after learning that his son had been killed in a car accident. He had seen Johnny angry, frustrated, exhausted, but he had never seen Johnny uncertain. Until now. Sagan's voice pulled the room back. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, all challenged by this point of pale light. He paused, not for effect, but because he needed to. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of something the audience couldn't name but could feel in their chests, in the stillness of the room, in the strange intimacy of watching a man realize he is smaller than he thought. Carson's hand moved to his tie. It was a reflex, something he did when he was thinking. He loosened it slightly, as if the air in the room had become thinner. Then he did something almost no one expected. He didn't make a joke. The commercial break was 17 seconds away. Johnny could feel it. He had an internal clock that was never wrong. 17 seconds, and he would have an escape, a reset, a chance to reassemble the pieces of the performance and carry on. But 17 seconds is a long time when you're live on national television and you have nothing to say. He looked at Sagan. Sagan looked back, not with expectation, but with something gentler. Understanding, maybe. Or just patience. "Carl," Johnny said finally. His voice was quieter than usual. "I don't know what to say to that." It was perhaps the most honest sentence he had ever spoken on television. The audience exhaled. A few people laughed, not because it was funny, but because they didn't know what else to do. But most of them just sat with it, sat with the strange, uncomfortable beauty of watching someone admit they had been stopped. Sagan smiled. Not a television smile, but a real one. "There's nothing to say," he said gently, Just something to remember. Johnny nodded. Then he turned to the camera, and for a fraction of a second, he looked directly at the people watching at home. Not as a host, but as a man. "We'll be right back," he said. The screen went to black. Backstage, during the commercial, Johnny didn't move. Normally, he would stand, adjust his jacket, check his notes for the next segment. But this time, he stayed in his chair. A production assistant approached, holding a clipboard. She started to say something about the next guest, but Ed waved her off. "Give him a minute," Ed said quietly. Johnny stared at the floor. His hands were folded in his lap, fingers laced together. He was thinking about the photograph, a pale blue dot. Everyone he had ever known, everyone he had ever interviewed, everyone who had ever watched his show, living on a speck of dust in a sunbeam. It should have felt nihilistic. It should have felt like despair. But it didn't. It felt, strangely, like relief. When the show came back from commercial, Johnny was himself again. Or at least, he was the version of himself that America knew. He introduced the next guest with the usual charm. He made the usual jokes. The machine kept running. But something had shifted, even if no one could quite articulate what. The letters started arriving 3 days later. Not hundreds, but enough. People writing to say they had felt it too. The stillness, the weight, the strange comfort of being reminded that their problems, their fears, their desperate grasping for significance, all of it was happening on a dot. One letter, from a woman in Ohio, said, "I've watched you for 15 years, and I've never seen you be quiet like that. Thank you for not ruining it with a joke." Johnny kept that letter in his desk drawer. He never responded to it. He didn't know how. Carl Sagan would return to The Tonight Show several more times over the years. He and Carson developed an easy rapport, the kind that comes from mutual respect, but they never talked about that night. Not directly. Once, years later, during another appearance, Sagan mentioned the photograph again. Johnny listened, smiled, and said, "You got me with that one, Carl." Sagan chuckled, "I got myself too." And that was enough. There is a mythology around Johnny Carson, that he was unknowable, that he was cold, that he lived behind the performance and never let anyone in. Some of that is true. Some of it is the story people tell because it's easier than the real one. The real story is simpler and sadder and more human. Johnny Carson was a man who spent 30 years being exactly what America needed him to be. He was the laugh when things were hard. He was the distraction when things were unbearable. He was the steady hand in the dark. But steadiness has a cost. And the cost is that you can't afford to stop. You can't afford to feel too much, because if you do, the machine breaks down. Except once. Once, a scientist from Cornell sat in the guest chair and talked about a photograph of Earth taken from 4 billion miles away. And Johnny Carson, the man who never stopped, stopped. He didn't cry. He didn't break. He didn't have a revelation that changed his life. He just listened. And in listening, he allowed himself to feel the thing he had spent decades avoiding, smallness. Not the humiliating kind, but the liberating kind. The kind that reminds you that your failures are not eternal, that your fame is not the center of the universe, that you are, like everyone else, just a passenger on a pale blue dot. The episode aired. The ratings were fine. Not spectacular, but fine. Most people probably didn't notice anything unusual. Television is like that. It moves so fast that moments slip past before you can grab them. But some people noticed, and some people remembered. Years later, after Carson retired, after he retreated to Malibu and stopped giving interviews, a journalist asked him if there was a moment on the show that stayed with him. A moment that mattered more than the others. Johnny thought for a long time. Then he said, "Carl Sagan once told me about a photograph. I think about it more than I should." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. There is no footage of Johnny's face during the full length of Sagan's monologue. The cameras cut away too often, following the rhythm of television. But the people who were in the studio that night remember. They remember the silence. They remember the stillness. They remember the strange, sacred feeling of watching someone powerful admit they had been moved by something larger than themselves. And they remember that, just for a moment, Johnny Carson stopped being a host and became what he had always been underneath. A man from Nebraska, trying to make sense of the world, just like everyone else. The pale blue dot is still out there, 4 billion miles away, a photograph exists in the memory of a spacecraft that has long since left our solar system. In it, Earth is smaller than a grain of sand, insignificant, forgettable. And yet, it is everything. Every conversation Johnny Carson ever had, every laugh, every silence, every moment of doubt, and every moment of grace, all of it happened there on that dot. Carl Sagan knew this, and for 3 minutes on a soundstage in Burbank, he made Johnny Carson know it too. The show went on. The next guest came out. The audience laughed. The credits rolled. But something had changed. Not in the world, but in the room. Not in the broadcast, but in the man sitting behind the desk. Johnny Carson had spent his entire career being the person who had the last word. But that night, he let someone else have it. And in doing so, he gave the audience something rarer than a joke. He gave them the truth. When the show ended that night, Johnny walked off stage without speaking to anyone. He went to his dressing room, closed the door, and sat in the chair by the window. Outside, Los Angeles glowed. Millions of lights, millions of lives, millions of stories, all unfolding at once, all thinking they mattered in ways that would last. Johnny looked up at the sky. The stars were barely visible through the smog and the light pollution, but they were there. Somewhere out there, a spacecraft was carrying a photograph. And in that photograph, invisible and unremarkable, was everything he had ever known. He sat there for a long time. And then, because the show always goes on, he stood up, took off his jacket, and went home. The next night, he was back. The smile was back. The jokes were back. The machine ran smoothly, the way it always had. But the people who knew him, Ed, the writers, the crew, noticed something small. Johnny was quieter between takes. He looked at people a little longer. He laughed a little less at his own jokes. It wasn't a transformation. It wasn't a breakdown or a breakthrough. It was just a shift. A small one. The kind that happens when you realize that the thing you've been holding on to so tightly, your career, your image, your control, isn't actually the thing that matters. What matters is the dot, and everyone on it, and the brief, fragile, ridiculous beauty of being alive at the same time. Johnny Carson died in 2005, 23 years after he walked away from The Tonight Show. He gave no interviews in his retirement. He made no public appearances. He lived quietly, far from cameras, far from audiences. Carl Sagan died in 1996 at 62, his work unfinished, his message still echoing, but the photograph remains. And somewhere in the archive, there is footage of a night when a talk show host and a scientist sat together and acknowledged, without saying it directly, that we are smaller than we think and more connected than we know. It was not the funniest episode Johnny Carson ever did. It was not the most famous, but it was perhaps the most human. And in the end, that's all any of us are. Just humans. On a dot. Trying to make sense of the vastness. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we find someone who helps us see it clearly. Even if it stops us in our tracks. Even if it leaves us with nothing to say. Even if all we can do is sit in the silence and let it be enough. Sonnet 4.5. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.